The Heinkel He-111 is perhaps one of the most well-known medium bombers of the Second World War, as its stepless glazed cockpit and unique wing design made it easily distinguishable from other aircraft. Large numbers of He-111s would be used by the Luftwaffe during the conflict, serving in the European, Mediterranean, and Middle Eastern theaters. After the war, variants of this aircraft would continue to see service in countries such as Spain, being used all the way into the 1970s. However, what many people don't know is that the very first He-111 bombers to enter production actually ended up with the Chinese Air Force and would see action against the Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War. This video will cover the story of China's He-111 squadron. The Heinkel He-111 started off as a civilian aircraft, its origins dating back to the early 1930s when the commercial aviation market in Germany was looking for faster planes. Following the success of their He-70, the German aircraft manufacturing company, Heinkel, decided to start working on a new design, eventually leading to the He-111. Development on this aircraft commenced in early 1934, with the first prototypes seeing flight on February 24, 1935. Within days, a second prototype was ready for testing, with more following soon after that. Some of these prototypes would eventually see service with Lufthansa, being used to carry passengers and mail. Placing an emphasis on speed and aerodynamics, the He-111 was very streamlined in shape, having elliptical, inverted gull wings and 2 engines instead of the usual 3. These features gave the aircraft excellent speed, handling, and maneuverability, with some prototypes reaching speeds in excess of 400 km per hour, making it one of the fastest passenger planes in the world at the time. The He-111 wouldn't just be used as a commercial aircraft. During the development process, the German Ministry of Aviation displayed interest in the design and asked for it to be developed into a medium bomber as well. As a result, some of the initial prototypes were built with a military role in mind, having features not normally seen on civilian aircrafts, like bomb bays. It was one of these prototypes that would give rise to the first military variant of the He-111 to enter production, the He-111A0. A total of 10 A0s were produced, undergoing trials in early 1936. However, the trials produced less than satisfactory results. The addition of bombs and other military equipment resulted in an increased weight and negatively affected the plane's aerodynamics. These in turn significantly impacted the plane's speed, handling, and maneuverability, resulting in the Luftwaffe refusing to accept the 10 A0s into service. For this reason, when representatives from China's Cantonese or Guangdong Provincial Government under Chen Jitang decided to purchase these planes, the Germans were delighted. After removing items like the bomb sights, radios, as well as navigational equipment, 8 He-111A0s were sent to China, arriving around mid-1936. 6 bombers were assembled at the Dongshan Aircraft Factory, while the other 2 were used for spare parts. These planes were operated by the Guangdong Provincial Airfoce's 4th Squadron and were based in Guangzhou. As the Chinese Heinkel He-111A0s were the very first military variant of this aircraft to enter production, they differed from the later ones used by the Luftwaffe in a number of ways. Instead of the distinctive stepless glazed cockpit of the later models, the A0s used a more conventional stepped cockpit design. Like early prototypes, they were powered by 2 WW2 6.0 liquid-cooled V12 engines, which gave it a cruising speed of roughly 275 km per hour and a maximum speed of 305 km per hour. Not only was the plane much slower than the prototypes it was based off of, it was much less maneuverable as well. Later variants used by the German military would rectify this problem by using more powerful engines. The A0s had a service ceiling of around 5,500 meters, as well as a maximum range of around 1,100 kilometers. The plane could carry around 680 to 1,000 kilograms of bombs in its bomb bay, which was divided into 2 compartments. Fully loaded, the He-111A0 weighed around 8,200 kilograms. In terms of armaments, the plane had 3 7.92mm MG-15 machine guns. One was mounted at the nose, while another was located on the top of the fuselage, facing the rear. The third was in a dustbin-style ventral turret on the bottom of the fuselage that could be lowered and raised as needed. On later models used by the German military, the number of machine guns would be increased and 2 waist gunner positions added in order to provide the aircraft with more protection. On these later variants, the ventral dustbin turret was also replaced with a gondola or Bodenlafetta style mount, as the dustbins were found to have a negative effect on the plane's aerodynamics when lowered. The Chinese bombers did not have these upgraded features. The A0s could be operated by a crew of 4, a pilot, a navigator who doubled as the bombardier, a radio operator who also operated the dorsal machine gun, as well as a ventral machine gunner. However, sources suggest that the Chinese Heinkels often had as many as 6 crew members on board, with the roles of navigator, bombardier, gunner, and radio operator likely being assigned to separate crew members, reducing their overall workload and increasing efficiency. While in the Guangdong Provincial Airfoce, the bombers were white or gray in color, possibly the same color they were in while undergoing testing in Germany. Each aircraft also had unique markings added on the nose, which were revealed during a ceremony. These consisted of the Chinese character Yue representing Guangdong province, followed by a one-digit number written in Chinese, ranging from 1 to 6. Each aircraft also had a name which was painted under the number, with bomber number 1 seen here bearing the name 公务员号, or civil servant. Nationalist roundels were also painted on the wings. The bombers didn't stay with the Guangdong Provincial Airfoce for very long. In June of 1936, right after the Heinkels entered service, Chen Zitang's Guangdong provincial government, along with the neighboring Guangxi province, decided to rebel against Chiang Kai-shek's central government in what would be known as the Liangguang Incident. However, Chen Zitang would lose the support of much of his own troops, and a month later, in July, the majority of his provincial air force defected to the central government. Among them were the Heinkel He-111 bombers, flying from their bases to the city of Nanchang, which was under the control of the central government. There, they were reorganized into the 19th Squadron of the 8th Air Group and would later be moved from Nanchang to Jian. The Heinkels were repainted in the standard color of the Central Air Force, olive green. It should be noted that, contrary to what some modern sources suggest, the planes were painted entirely in olive green and never had a gray or blue-gray colored underside. The rudders were painted with blue and white stripes, and nationalist roundels were painted on the wings. The nose markings were also removed and the aircrafts renumbered. Instead of a one-digit number, the planes now had a four-digit number, ranging from 1901 to 1906, with the first two digits representing the squadron and the last two digits representing the aircraft's number within the squadron. These new numbers were painted in white Arabic numerals towards the rear of the fuselage, on both the left and right sides. After the start of the war with Japan, the 19th Squadron was moved to Heinkel and often participated in bombing raids alongside the Martin 139 WCs of the 30th Squadron. The 19th only operated a maximum of 3 He-111s at a time, with the others either serving as backup, undergoing repairs, or cannibalized for parts. The first action the He-111s would see against the Japanese was on August 25, 1937, although some sources suggest a slightly later date, in September of 1937. The commander of the 8th Air Group, Siemang, would accompany the bombers on this mission, which was to bomb Japanese ships around Shanghai. Taking the pilot seat on Bomber 1902, Siemang replaced the original pilot, Huang Pulun, who moved to the co-pilot seat. Besides 1902, two other He-111s would participate in the mission, Bombers 1903 and 1905. In addition to the three Heinkels, two Martin 139 WC medium bombers from the 30th Squadron would also participate as well. The 5 bombers were to be escorted by the 17th Squadron's Boeing 281s, an export variant of the P-26 pea shooter. Taking off from their base in Heinkel, the Heinkels first landed in Nanjing to be refueled and loaded with bombs. On their way to Shanghai, however, the 3 Heinkels, due to their slower speed, became separated from the rest of the formation, effectively dividing the force into 2 groups. The 2 Martins with their Boeing 281 escorts arrived at the target area first, catching the Japanese off guard. After releasing their bombs, they turned around and headed back. When the 3 He-111s arrived a while later, the Japanese were already on full alert. Braving the Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, the 3 bombers managed to drop their bombs on the Japanese ships around the village of Liuhe before immediately turning around. Unfortunately, the slow speed of the He-111A0s, as well as their weak defensive armaments, made them easy prey for the Japanese fighters. Within minutes, Bomber 1903 was hit. The machine guns on the aircraft quickly fell silent as the exposed gunners were either killed or incapacitated by enemy fire. Leaking fuel and with an engine on fire, the pilots realized that there was no way they could make it back to Nanjing. Breaking away from the formation, they desperately pushed their stricken plane towards the nearest airport, Shanghai's Hongqiao Airport, crash landing there a short while later. What remained of the plane was soon completely destroyed on the ground by Japanese aircraft. Bomber 1905 didn't fare much better, being forced to crash land in Changzhou on the way back. Only the lead plane flown by the air group commander, Bomber 1902, managed to return to Nanjing, heavily damaged and with most of the crew being seriously wounded or killed. The first combat mission of the He-111s had essentially ended in a disaster, and for this, Siemang would be relieved of his post and court-martialed. However, the charges were later dropped and he would be reinstated to his original position. Siemang would go on to have a distinguished career in the Air Force, surviving both World War II and the Chinese Civil War, eventually retiring with the rank of lieutenant general. The commander of the 30th Squadron, Shi Youxin, was also blamed for this disaster, as his Martin 139s had failed to wait for the slower HE-111s. He would quit the Air Force soon after this, joining the army instead, rising quickly through the ranks due to his connections. He was allegedly killed in late 1940 for conspiring to defect to the Japanese. The next HE-111 was lost on October 1st, this time to a case of friendly fire, and would once again result in a defection and execution. After receiving advance warning of a Japanese raid on Heinkel, which was where the 19th Squadron was based at the time, the planes at the airfield, including the Heinkels, were ordered to scramble to prevent them from being destroyed on the ground by Japanese bombs. These planes began returning to Heinkel in the evening after it had become apparent that the earlier warning was a false alarm. The events that followed were recorded in the memoirs of Royal Leonard, an American advisor who was training Chinese bomber crews at the time. Flying in a Boeing 247 close to one of the Heinkels, Leonard noticed the outline of a Chinese fighter approaching his plane as he prepared to land. As he waved a greeting to the Chinese fighter pilot, what happened next caught him completely by surprise. He recounted, quote, "To my amazement, I saw yellowish streaks sing by. Tracer bullets. The fool was firing on me." The fool Leonard was referring to was Peng Zhou, an inexperienced cadet from the 34th Squadron. Patrolling the area around the airfield in a Hawk 2, he had just misidentified Leonard's plane as a Japanese bomber, likely due to a mixture of poor visibility, inexperience, and overexcitement. Being a seasoned pilot, Leonard immediately pushed the nose of his plane down while performing a series of cartwheels, bringing it to within 500 feet from the ground. Hugging the terrain as he sped forward, Leonard managed to get away from the Chinese fighter. The nearby Heinkel wasn't so lucky. As the American pilot pulled up from his maneuvers, he heard a loud explosion as a bright light illuminated the night sky. Once again mistaking a friendly plane for a Japanese bomber, Peng Zhou had shot down one of the HE-111s, killing everyone on board. Among the deceased was the 19th Squadron's deputy squadron commander, Zhou Lianru. For his actions, Peng Zhou was sentenced to prison time and upon his release continued to serve in the Chinese Air Force. However, with his record stained and likely resentful over how he was treated by his fellow aviators, he eventually defected to the Chinese puppet government under Wang Jingwei. For this, he was arrested and executed after the war. The HE-111s participated in another raid on the 14th of October, with initial plans calling for 3 to participate in the mission, alongside 3 Martin 139s from the 30th Squadron. However, one was unable to take off due to mechanical issues, so only 2 Heinkels took part in the raid. The bombers once again flew from Heinkel to Nanjing to be fueled and armed before taking off again bound for Shanghai. After releasing their bombs over targets in the Yangshupu area, both HE-111s successfully returned to base. On October 22nd, 2 HE-111s participated in a large night raid against the Japanese airfield at Baoshan, alongside other planes from the 5th, 6th, and 8th Air Groups. On the way back, Bomber 1906 became separated in the dark and after running low on fuel, was forced to make an emergency landing in Lukou, located just outside Nanjing. By late 1937, of the original 6 Heinkels, only Bomber 1902 was still operational. Some of the planes had been lost during the initial months of fighting, while those that had been damaged were likely used for parts instead of being repaired. Having lost the majority of their aircraft, the 19th Squadron was transferred to Lanzhou to be re-equipped with Soviet TB-3s, while the last HE-111 was incorporated into the Bomber Academy. Stationed in Yichang, the Heinkel, along with 3 Italian SM-81Bs of the 13th Squadron, represented all the aircraft available to the Academy. Within a few months, though, the HE-111 once again found itself as the sole survivor after all 3 SM-81Bs were lost to accidents. Without enough aircraft to use, the Academy was soon disbanded. The HE-111 was then transferred to the 14th Squadron around February of 1938. The 14th Squadron would make history on May 19, 1938, when it carried out a bombing raid against Japanese cities on the island of Kyushu. This raid made China the very first Allied country to attack the Japanese home islands during a conflict which would later be known as the Second World War. The actual bombing was carried out by 2 Martin 139 WCs, which dropped leaflets instead of bombs. Although the HE-111 didn't participate directly in the bombing raid, it did serve as a transport and provided logistics support for the mission. This was the last major operation the HE-111 participated in, and the plane wouldn't see much use after this. Eventually, it would end up in the city of Chengdu. In early 1943, it was handed to the newly formed Central Air Transport Corporation to be used as a transport plane. In late 1943, the Heinkel flew from Chengdu to Kunming to be converted from a bomber to a transport capable of carrying passengers and supplies. Among the modifications made to the plane included the removal of the bomb racks and machine guns. Much of the glazing on the nose of the plane was removed as well. As this aircraft was expected to carry passengers, extra windows were also added to the sides of the fuselage. The largest modification made to the plane, however, was the replacement of the engines. Due to a lack of spare parts, it was decided to replace the plane's original WW2 liquid-cooled V12 engines with two Wright R1820 Cyclone 9-cylinder air-cooled radial engines. These engines were also used on planes like the DC-2 and DC-3, which were much more common in China at the time, making parts easier to acquire. However, a few sources suggest that the new engines may have instead been a pair of Pratt & Whitney R1690 Hornet engines, the same ones used by the Junkers Ju-52s. Although the shape of the engine cowling more closely resembles those found on DC-2s and DC-3s, without clear photos or proper documentation, it will likely be difficult to say for certain which type of engine was used on the modified HE-111. In addition to the modifications, the Heinkel also received updated markings. While the plane seems to have kept its original olive green paint, the white numbers on the fuselage, the nationalist roundels on the wings, as well as the blue and white stripes on the rudder were all removed. Towards the rear of the fuselage, replacing the original 4-digit number, was the insignia of the Central Air Transport Corporation, the Chinese character Zhong, painted in white on a dark blue circle. This marking has confused many people as it is extremely similar to the one used by the China National Aviation Corporation, or CNAC. However, the white registration marking of XT-ATC painted under the wing suggests that this is a Central Air Transport Corporation plane instead. The aircraft was renumbered from 1902 to number 2, which was painted in white on the rudder with a Chinese character. In front of the number is another Chinese character for Zhong. Unfortunately, before the plane got to see much use, its luck finally ran out. In December of 1944, the last Chinese HE-111 was damaged beyond repair in a crash at Kunming, bringing an end to the story of German medium bombers in China. Although at one point considered to be among the most modern bombers in the Chinese Air Force, by late 1944, they had long since been replaced by other planes like the American B-25s. Still, the HE-111s had managed to make a mark in the history of the Chinese Air Force, providing them with valuable experience on how to operate bombers more effectively, and being connected to some of their brightest and darkest days during a conflict known as the Second Sino-Japanese War.